Hello, this is children's literature. I am your professor, Joe Teacher. Today we will be talking about the history of children's literature a little bit. The history of children's literature is in many ways tied to the history of the development of human language. So much of what children are told comes directly from their parents, of course, especially their mothers. And so in order to understand the development of children's literature, we need to really go back and kind of immerse ourselves a little bit, at least, into the history of the development of language itself. So we're going to be taking this pretty far back, almost to the beginning of human development, at least modern humans. So let us begin. Again, I apologize for the poor production values. Again, my equipment here is pretty basic, and I'm just doing the best that I can. There's quite a bit of lag between the audio and the video. Various things keep locking up, so please bear with me as I prepare these things. I know the conditions are not optimal, but hopefully you'll enjoy this information and learn a lot from it. I would encourage you to focus as we're going through these things, because a lot of questions from the midterm come from these first few lectures. In fact, I would probably say the majority of the questions on the midterm come from the first two lectures in the course introduction. So this is probably good to focus on, excuse me, to maybe eliminate distractions and to really kind of give this some thought as we go through it, so you might remember it later. So the history of children's literature really begins with something we call the oral tradition. And the oral tradition is, we can think of it as literature before the creation of writing systems. And these oral traditions are still in development in places today. There are still cultures on Earth, isolated cultures. Many of them are found in the Amazon basin in South America. There are also a few in the South Pacific, cultures that don't have writing systems. But when anthropologists and sociologists and linguists go to make contact with these people, they inevitably find that they have a rich tradition of storytelling and complex systems of archetypes and characters and creation myths and legends and all of the other things that go with it. My cat's talking. It's really amazing the number of stories that come from the time before when humans developed writing. So it's interesting from the standpoint of understanding literature to look at language. How did language develop? When did it develop? One of the earliest clues we have to the development of modern culture, and when I say modern, I mean modern humans that have the ability to communicate visually or through language. One of the earliest signs we have of this are the cave paintings that are found throughout the world. This is a picture of the Cueva de los Nanos in southern Argentina. These were made approximately 9,000 years ago. YBP equals years before present. And we can see here a collection of handprints that were made probably by placing hands on the rock and spraying out pigments from the mouth of the person and to make these handprints. And it really speaks to the not only the collective identity that these people felt that they were part of a community, but also the understanding that each individual was unique and different. We see lots of different. This isn't all one person. This is many different people that had put their hands up there and made this, almost as if to say, I was here. I lived here, and I was I was with these other people. So it's pretty amazing. These pictures are actually fairly recent compared to some other ones. There are some that are much older. Some of the oldest cave paintings are older than human language. Some scientists see them as a bridge between our non-speaking and speaking ancestors. The paintings that I am showing here are from a cave in France called Lascaux. It was discovered in the 1940s. And this cave system contains over 9,000 figures. Let's look at it for a few moments here. So we see these beautiful and incredibly powerful images. Most of them, the majority of the images in the cave are of large animals. And these animals would have been, for the people that made these paintings, a source of life. It would have been their food, their clothing, their tools, everything that they needed to survive would have been um, would have come from these animals that they hunted. So these things to them were almost uh, magical in their uh, in their power, and of course, for a uh, for a primitive human using stone tools to hunt and to kill one of these large animals would have been a huge accomplishment. So their entire life was based on whether or not they could hunt and kill and capture one of these things. So it's not surprising that this is what their culture um, would have been based on and represented by in these paintings. I'm struck by, when I look at these paintings in Lascaux, I'm struck by the power of the imagery. There, you notice that in every single case, the animals are not standing still. They're always running. And you can really see the power that these animals possess. To these humans, they must have been incredible, almost mythical creatures to them. Continuing on here, hopefully. Let's see. Again, I apologize for the production values here. This is pretty basic, doing the best we can with our tiny computer. I don't have a big gaming laptop, so my video card is junk, but it's muddling through. Anyway, so what happened between Lascaux and Shakespeare? What was the thing that triggered the development of human language? And when scientists look at the development of human language, they really look at two factors that were responsible for the development of complex speaking patterns. Number one, the first was the development of the brain, structures in the brain. The brain needed to be large enough to contain the neurological structures used for speech. The second was the development of vocal structures in the neck and mouth, larynx, pharynx, vocal cavities, tongue, lips, etc., that would allow humans to produce complex sounds. We can see here in this map, in this diagram of hominid evolution, these pre-modern hominids down at the bottom there you can see that have the kind of pinkish color. If you look at Africanus, Australopithecus africanus down here, he had a brain size of about 500 cc's. So if you think about a small water bottle, a 500 cc water bottle, that's about the size of the brain of Australopithecus africanus. We know from studying these fossils that the brain structure of the Australopithecus africanus is pretty simple. Not a whole lot of difference between this hominid's brain size and that of pre-hominid species. If we look up to the top, the earliest, what we would call modern human species, Homo habilis, his brain size at about 950 cc's has almost doubled. And these two species were probably maybe around at about the same time. So something happened. There was a huge jump in brain size. There are a lot of theories. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about why that is, but certainly the development of more complex tool usages, more complex social structures There's a lot of different theories about why this happened, but somehow brain size began to become an important factor in terms of the survival rates of species. And so it's no small thing to have a 950 cc brain. That's a lot of energy. Your brain takes up a huge amount of energy. And so in order to sustain uh, a brain that size, you need to consume more calories. You need to be able uh, to access more energy in terms of the food sources that you have. So it definitely needs to pay off in terms of your genetic survival uh, for you to have a brain that size. So what are the impacts of having a brain that size? We can see here that Homo sapiens, our species, has a 1,400 cc brain, so much larger even than Homo habilis. What are the effects of this on human biology? When we look at the larger brain over time, this allowed for the development of special structures related to language processing. Most of the structures that are involved in brain in the processing of language lie in the outer layer of the brain, what we call the cerebral cortex. Um, this part of the brain is absent, or largely absent, or much smaller in the pre-hominid species. So let's look here at some of the areas that are important for the processing of language. The first is Broca's area, here in the front of the brain. This area is primarily associated with the production of speech, speaking, language, vocabulary, uh, uh, the production of language, the motion of the lips and the breathing, etc. Another area is called Wernicke's area. This is associated with the comprehension of speech, what we might call listening skills. It's not surprising that it's found near the back of the brain. This is close to the occipital lobe, where the visual, and the temporal lobe, where hearing is processed. So hearing and speech are both found near in the same area. And then probably the most important area related to language processing is the parietal lobe up here and near the back of the brain, comprehension of language. And this is connecting language to symbols, connecting, for example, the word red to the color that we associate with that. So the symbolic uh, uh, concept of language is processed in the parietal lobe. So this hominid evolution uh, led to the development of these brain structures that made language possible. But this isn't the only part of uh, uh, the formula. The other part is the development of the vocal structures in modern human physiology that allow us to make the complex sounds. If you ever listen to a baby trying to speak, you can hear that there are certain sounds that they just can't make. Uh, they can make almost all speech sounds except quantal I, A, U, and A. This is very similar to the speaking limitations of a chimpanzee. And you can see in the size and shape of the oral cavity, the size and shape of the nasal cavity, most importantly, the length of the pharynx and the length of the larynx and the position of the vocal cords. Very similar between a human infant and a chimpanzee. An adult human, if we look at the vocal structures here, has a much larger and shorter oral cavity, the angle between the oral cavity and the lips is much more pronounced. Um, the pharynx, the biggest difference, the length of the pharynx allows for much more, uh, uh, the production of much more nuanced vowel sounds, especially. So this is the development we can see here of modern human physiology that allows these sounds to be created. So as recently as 200,000 years before presence, humans had the ability to speak. But did they speak? And if so, why? This is a big question that uh, uh, modern linguists ask. When did human speech develop? When did humans start speaking, and why did they speak initially? And there's several hypotheses about the origins of human speech. One is the gestural hypothesis, that human speech developed from nonverbal communication like hand gestures and facial expressions. So what we might call body language, that humans had maybe complex sign language systems, and language developed out of those systems later. The second is the symbolist hypothesis, that human speech developed from visual art, such as that seen in ancient cave paintings. Maybe ancient humans had a complex system of kind of pictograms, pictures for the simple pictures uh, that would show directions, for example, north, south, east, and west, to tell other groups that they met where the berries were, or where were the deer were, or where the danger was. So we know already, of course, from these cave paintings that these types of visual symbols and art were within the capacity, even complex and beautiful pictures like we see at Lascaux. So it's not hard to imagine human speech developing from those visual symbols. The third is a genetic hypothesis, that human speech developed when the specialized structures necessary developed through random mutations in the human genome. I find this to be a little bit less compelling. Uh, it seems that uh, to have uh, uh, some type of pre-programmed language system developed through the human genome uh, seems very, very difficult to imagine that process. Um, However, um, one of the things that we see is the development of language in many places simultaneously without the contact between each other. One group of early humans didn't begin speaking, and then that speaking spread everywhere. It was much more of a case of isolated pockets of humans beginning to speak around the same time, independent of one another. This kind of, leads to the question: how could that happen? How could it happen in South America and in the Mesopotamian river valleys and in all of the other places that it seemed to happen at the same time? You know, the obvious clue that this is what happened is the massive number of language systems, I think over 6,000 different languages, so that were at one point spoken. So this is a lot of different peoples talking at the same time, independent from each other. So how did human speech develop? Probably never going to know, but maybe it's a combination of these three things. However it happened, at some point long ago, humans started speaking, and they haven't shut up since. From ethnographic evidence, we can see that language developed rapidly once it had begun. Given that there are over 6,000 distinct languages, along with many more related dialects, we can see that language most likely developed in many separate places simultaneously and independent from one another. And once there was language, there were stories. And we're still talking now about pre-writing systems language. This is before the development of writing. So what were people talking about? We have clues about the types of stories that were told. Sometimes these are called myths. And there are many versions of these ancient stories that have survived into modern times as traditional stories, which include many types of tales, including creation myths, fables, fairy tales, folklore, and legends. I want to talk about what these are. So myths are the ancient stories that come from the pre-written period. Creation myths deal with the origin of the world. When did the world begin? How did the world begin? Fables are stories that often contain a lesson, something that they want somebody to learn. These stories are also often uh, are based on animals, different animals. Probably you've heard of Aesop's fables, and the maybe, for example, the story of the lion and the mouse. And the lion is uh, going catches a mouse and he's going to kill it, and the mouse says, "Don't kill me. You might need my help someday." And the lion laughs and says, "I'll never need your help." And of course, the lion eventually does need the mouse's help when he's caught in a net. And the mouse says, "You let me go before, and so I'll help you now." And he uses his sharp teeth to cut the net, and the lion is released. And so this is a fable that teaches you never know when you might need a friend. So be kind to everybody. Fairy tales. Fairy tales come from these ancient myths as well, and many of these contain magical creatures, fairies and giants and witches. Folklore, these are the ancient stories as well that come from the, the oldest stories. Many of these stories contain local legends, and legends themselves are based on history. Many legends, for example, come from the Greek tradition. If you've heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer, may or may have not been a real person. Uh, these legends are based on ancient wars with heroes like Odysseus and Achilles and the Trojans. All of these ancient stories may or may not be based on real historical events in some way. So these are all of the different types of stories that survive into modern times to be recorded in writing that had their basis in the oral tradition. Myths are common in all world cultures, and many have recurring plots and characters. These common stories are called archetypes. Joseph Campbell connected ancient myths from around the world to human behavior and psychology. He believed, for example, that the story of the hero is a metaphor for how we all face the fear of death. One of the things that Joseph Campbell noted as he went around to collect the myths from all of the different world cultures that he studied was we see the same stories again and again throughout the world. The same kinds of stories occur in ancient Egypt that we see in South American cultures. Even some of the same symbols show up again and again in their writing systems. So it's very interesting that the same stories are told again and again throughout all of the different cultures. He categorized and organized these into archetypes that contain the kind of patterns of stories and characters that we see again and again and again. Folk and fairy tales can be classified into systems that categorize them according to their themes. One such system is called the Arne-Thompson-Uther classification of folk tales. We'll look at that later when we're studying Cinderella. The earliest beginnings of children's literature, what we could begin to call the first printed, published children's literature, begins in the early part of the 18th century. There are a lot of reasons why it happened at that time. There was a rise of literacy. There was a rise of economic stability. There was a rise of the middle class and urbanization and the beginnings of middle class education for children. So we're going to look at some of the different things that contributed to the development of this genre. In his book, Centuries of Childhood, Philip Rees argued that before this time, childhood itself didn't exist, not at least as we think of it today. Other scholars point out that childhood instruction would have taken place prior to this in a religious setting, using Bible stories as training tools. So this is maybe not the beginning of children's literature because of the use of the Bible as a training tool and teaching children to read and stuff like that. So we're talking about maybe a non-biblical children's literature. In 1690, British philosopher John Locke published an essay concerning human understanding, in which he put forward the idea that the human infant is born tabula rasa, a blank whiteboard, to use a modern equivalent. It is the job of the wise parent, in his opinion, or the teacher, to carefully fill that whiteboard with important information. So this got people thinking, I've got this child here. It's my responsibility to train them and to teach them what they need to know to survive and thrive in this modern world with economics and politics and all of the other complexities of modern life. What do they need to know? How do I educate a child so that they can survive in the world and in society and do well? This led to the rise of a market for children's books. And one of the first people to capitalize on this market was named John Newbery. John Newbery's Pretty Little Pocketbook, which was published in 1744, is seen as one of the first books that was made specifically for children. When parents purchased this book, John Newbery used an interesting marketing trick. He gave, with each book that was sold, he gave a toy. And for boys, they received a ball. And you can see here, Baseball, a poem about baseball. The ball, once struck off, away flies the boy to the next defined post, and then home with joy. So this little pretty pocketbook contains these short poems that based loosely on the things that children would like. This is, by the way, the first example of baseball in print, the game baseball being mentioned in printed literature. It's the earliest mention. So if a boy bought a book, he got a ball. If the book was for a little girl, she got a sewing kit, which little girls would have loved. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was another influential voice in the development of the concept of childhood and childhood education. He said that children are born innocent and that their natural curiosity and imagination should be encouraged. This aspect of the imagination led to the popularity of fairy tales, stories that were fantastic. He believed that allowing a child to imagine things that were magical and things that were dangerous and adventurous, romantic, that this was important because the development of the imagination led to a much more fruitful life. This is during the Romantic era, and the Romantic uh, poets and the Romantic writers of that time elevated human imagination almost to a religious status. They believed that the imagination, the human ability to imagine the impossible, to imagine the fantastic, to imagine other worlds, that this was what made us human, and that ability should be nurtured in children especially. So around this time, we begin to see a conflict arising in Western culture between two different ideas about what humans are. And one of them is a very Christian, very religion oriented worldview. The other one is a scientific worldview based on reason. Uh, it has, in these 5 different areas I'll speak to here quickly, 2 different worldviews about what it means to be a human, what it means to be part of society, our attitude towards nature, the difference between science and religion, and the difference and importance of art and literature. So for the Puritans, these are the Christians, the religious people around the beginning or the end of the 18th century. They believed in original sin, that men are evil, that they're born sinners, that God doesn't like us. However, the Enlightenment thinkers, these are the early scientists, believed that men are born pure. This is the tabula rasa that John Locke was talking about. This idea that if humans could perfect society, that they could perfect themselves. Puritans believed that because men are evil, society is needed to control us. The Enlightenment thinkers said society is bad. All this competition, all of this me, our society and the economic system leads to a type of selfishness that ruins mankind's purity. If we could somehow return to a much simpler world, we would all be better people. Nature is meant to be used by men in the Christian worldview. It's here for us to use. The Enlightenment thinkers saw nature as pure and innocent, and it was beautiful and meant to be studied by men and not ruined. Puritanism believed that mankind should be very limited in their scientific inquiry. They shouldn't question God's order and look too much into it. Rather, the Enlightenment saw science as a noble pursuit, that it was good to look into the workings of the world and the universe to try to discover how the world worked. The Puritans had a very negative view about art and literature. In fact, anything that wasn't the Bible in many Puritan societies was considered evil and even made illegal. Any book that they found would probably be burnt if it wasn't Christian in nature. The Enlightenment, on the other hand, put an emphasis on human intelligence and the research and writing of books and the sharing of knowledge was very important for them. But this conflict carries over into even the world of children's literature. These two, you can see that depending on whether you were a Puritan or whether you were a believer in the Enlightenment and more focused on the scientific aspect of human life, would depend on what kind of books you would expose your child to. Traditional stories, the folk and fairy tales of the old oral tradition, became the subject of academic research at this time as professors and other types of sociologists began to collect and publish them. The Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen and other European scholars collected and published hundreds of stories in the early 19th century. These are the Grimm brothers here. Their collection of fairy tales including Cinderella and many other common fairy tales, were collected by them from the oral tradition in Germany and the Low Countries and elsewhere. And these stories became the foundation for modern children's literature. We still see movies are made all the time that are based on the Grimm brothers' research. We then enter, in the mid-19th century, the golden age of children's literature. As paper and printing became cheaper, there was a shift away from traditional stories to more imaginative works written specifically for and often about children. We'll look at some of these quickly here. A perfect example is English author Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. This book was among the first novel-length works written for a child audience, and it created the genre that we now call fantasy, the works that are purely imaginary in nature. We won't watch this video right now. We don't have time. We'll come back later to that. Another British author, Robert Louis Stevenson, published very popular books in what we would now call the adventure genre, works that involve incredible and dangerous journeys by intrepid explorers. Treasure Island, one such book, involves shipwrecks, pirates, and daring escapes. If you like the Pirates of the Caribbean, many of those stories are based on some of these stories by Robert Louis Stevenson. In America, Louisa May Alcott published a semi-autobiographical coming-of-age story titled Little Women. Coming-of-age stories were about the transition between childhood and adulthood. Many of these were about young ladies as they grew up and began to discover the boys, for example, and the difficulties of being an adult. This type of story was wildly popular and described a difficult transition from childhood to adulthood. Mark Twain, another American author, wrote books like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, novels that depicted the reality of a child's life in the American West. These also became wildly popular for children and adults alike. At that time, most of the people in the United States lived in the large cities in the East. So in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, places like that. And they were fascinated by these stories that were set out in the American wilderness, with children who basically spent most of their time out in the rivers and the forests of the American West, having adventures and meeting Native Americans and fighting bears and whatnot. So these stories became very popular among city children who wanted to know what it was like for children who had that more adventurous lifestyle. We're running out of time, so I'll skip that video too. The golden age of children's literature is said to have ended at the beginning of World War I with the publication, slowing in the period between World War I and World War II for a variety of reasons. Probably the biggest reason was the rise of what we would call electronic media, radio, movies, cinema, and later television. Now I think children read very little. Most people spend most of their time, most children spend a lot of time watching things on television or looking at their phone. So reading has really kind of declined since the golden age of children's literature. Maybe childhood would be better if we could return to that. I don't know. Of course I would say that. I'm an English teacher. I kind of lament the end of reading. I grew up a reader. We didn't have a television when I was growing up. My parents were very religious and didn't think that there was anything good on television to watch, and they were probably right about that, at least. So growing up, reading was my life. My favorite place in my whole town was the library, and my mother was a reader and took us to the library every week we would go and I would get a large stack of books from the children's section. I read almost all of the books in the library, I think, as a child. I really loved reading, and I still love reading today. I read a lot, and I think that for me that has been one of the most wonderful parts of my life has been my love of reading, and it's really exposed me to a lot of ideas from different cultures and from different things that I might not have seen, and it's really been wonderful to me. And I'm I kind of feel sad for people that don't read. That I feel sad for that reading has kind of lost its popularity because whenever I watch TV, I don't see anything really that good on there compared to what I'm reading. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Since that time, children's literature as read text has become eclipsed in cultural importance largely by audio and visual forms like radio dramas, films, especially animation and television shows. These in turn changed and adapted throughout the 20th century as parenting and educational expectations liberalized in the West. Content that expresses gender and racial equality, and more recently exposes children to a variety of family compositions. You know, there's children's books now that, like, Tommy Has Two Mommies, that look at different types of families. Content that is respectful of cultures around the world. Content that emphasizes the awareness of social issues like animal rights, environmental protection, and justice. So, children's literature has become in the West almost a political tool to kind of indoctrinate children into a variety of different worldviews. So, I gave you this group discussion for your homework yesterday. I want you to continue working on this. And your homework is similar to yesterday. I did add one thing. I would like for you to contact your other group members and create your Cacao Talk group this week. The captain of each group should take the lead on that to contact the other group members and create a Cacao Talk group. Using the Cacao Talk, and you can use text, voice, or video chat, it's up to you, complete the discussion above. So I want you to kind of talk to each other, talk it out, your answers. In your assignment notebook, I would like for you to write just a little bit about your favorite book, describe it, why did you like it. We're talking about when you were a small child. In your assignment notebook, write about your favorite book when you were a small child. And also, write down your answers to this week's discussion questions in your assignment notebook so that I can look at those later. So go ahead, jot down the answers to these questions in your assignment notebook, okay? And I will collect those and look at those at some point in the future. Also, when you're using your Cacao Talk, don't delete your Cacao Talk conversations. I will be checking those at some point with each of the team captains. So keep a record of your Cacao Talk conversations somehow. Don't delete those conversations because I will be checking those later to make sure every group completed that assignment. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry, as I said, for the technical. Cat's meowing, my stomach is growling. I think I should probably eat breakfast before I do these videos. I hope you couldn't hear that. I think I need to go eat my breakfast. So, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your patience. I know this probably isn't as exciting as a classroom experience. I hope that it's informational and interesting to you, and hopefully we can get back into the classroom soon. So, see you next week.